I'll start. Welcome everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Eva Nanopoulos, for those of you that don't know me. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center of Law and Society in a Global Context, together with Tanzil Chaudhuri, who is there waving at you. And we're really very thrilled to be resuming our Marxism and Law seminar series, and particularly our discussion of new books that feature more materialist engagements with law, and even more so to be beginning really the year with a discussion of Christine Schwöbel-Patel's new and inspiring book, Marketing Global Justice, the Political Economy of International Criminal Law. That was published just last year, so it's fresh out of the press, so to speak. And I think the timing is quite uncanny too, because as we are waiting here at Queen Mary for the results of our reballoting for strike action over issues really that you know, are all too connected with one of Christine's basically essential theme, and that is the marketization of public institutions, values, and society at large. As she put it, even the sort of colonization of the public sphere by sort of markets logics. And I won't say very much about the book, but I think this is also why it is such an important contribution. On one level, it is a book about international criminal law through the lens of branding and marketing, but it also poses a series of questions that are relevant not only to lawyers, but to all of us, you know. Who stands to win from marketized notions of justice or higher education? Who stands to lose? What are the material factors? Who are the actors that are sort of driving these developments, and what kind of techniques are they relying on, and how do we resist them, really? And this broader outlook of the book itself, I think, reflects something more general about Christine and her trajectory and her interests, because the truth is that although, you know, she's played a pioneer role in more critical engagements with international criminal law, she has really contributed well beyond that field to critical perspectives about the role of international law in its entanglement with imperialism, neocolonialism, racism. And so it's really a huge pleasure, Christine, and I'm privileged to have you with us today, and tuning in from Warwick, which I think where she is currently a reader in law. And to engage with this book, I think we're very fortunate to have really a very impressive set of speakers from a variety of disciplines, which really again reflect Christine's own interdisciplinary outlook. So I'll give them to you in the order in which hopefully they will present. First, we have Eric Leflat from Kent Law School. Here he goes, he waves, who has done also important work on the relationship between international law and modern political forms, such as the popular will, which was, I think, the topic of his PhD, from a more materialist perspective, and also asks more general questions, basically about the emancipatory role of law. Similar concerns also inform a second speaker, Honor Brabazon, from who is currently at Saint Jerome in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies. But if she's also thinking about transformative potential in law, I think she's taking a slightly different, more empirical outlook through research across a number of countries, engaging with social movements, etc. But she has also done a lot of important work on the role of law in neoliberalism, and with a very important collection pioneering really on neoliberal legality. And last but not least, we'll close with Melissa Aronchik from the Schools of Communication and Information at Rutgers University, who is really the non-longer amongst us, and we hope will take a slightly, maybe we'll have a slightly different take on the book. Melissa works in, put it, critical media studies. She's interested in processes of valorization, how we come to value things, how ideas, things, and practices become valuable. And she has just published her latest work, as I understand it, in this area, which is more sort of applying these notions in the field of environmentalism, called A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and the Politics of Environmentalism. It's her third book, and the previous ones addressed a theme that, again, is central to Christine's work today, which is branding. So we'll start with Christine, who will introduce the book for about 15 minutes, and then each of our respondents will get an opportunity to talk for about 10 or 12 minutes, as said, but we know how sometimes things overlap. But even if that happens, I think we've left enough time for Christine to return to some of the issues, and all of you also to contribute your own thoughts, and hopefully we can initiate some productive discussion. Thanks so much again, and Christine, I leave it to you now.
Thank you, Eva, for this lovely introduction, and thank you to you and Tansil for putting this together. It's lovely to see some familiar faces in this time of Zoom and pandemic fatigue, and on a Friday, yeah, in the UK is a Friday night, and yeah, so I'm incredibly honoured that my book features in this brilliant series, and I'm grateful to the discussants for taking the time to read and engage with the book. Eva's already just introduced the discussants, but I just also wanted to say a few words on why the three of you, why it's so great to be in discussion with the three of you. So Melissa's book, Branding the Nation, is such a wonderful critical study of nation branding that I think everyone interested in the state and the market and their interaction should read, and certainly everyone who's looking at international law and international relations. And I'm so much looking forward to your latest co-authored book, Melissa, A Strategic Nature. Honor, as many here will know, and as Eva already mentioned, was one of the first to identify the need to study the interaction of neoliberalism and law. Many of those who have gone on to engage with this theme did so on the invitation of Honor in her collection, Neoliberal Legality. And Eric is part of a generation of scholars that work with history and legal matters in a genuinely exciting and rigorous fashion, and I feel I still have much to learn from him. So I thought I'd start off with two anecdotes that feature in the book that tell you something about why I decided to write this book in the first place. Both of them are from separate periods in which I was living and working in The Hague, the self-styled international city of peace and justice. That is the city brand of The Hague. I should say that these anecdotes and no means self-branding anecdotes in demonstrating my importance in the global justice sector. Quite the opposite. I was very much a tiny cog in what I realized was this huge industry and machinery. So in 2007, I was an intern at the International Criminal Court, and one of the tasks that was allocated to me was to create a PowerPoint presentation for the registrar for when we visited different international organizations based in The Hague to talk about the work of the ICC. And it really seemed to me that, you know, he would do his thing about talking about the ICC, and I would sort of move along with the PowerPoints. It seemed to me that it was like a sort of traveling salesman and his team talking, but in such a local fashion, right? Just in this one city, but going from one international organization to the other, talking about global justice. That sales pitch seemed not only so odd to me because it was so local, but also because at that time the ICC's courtrooms were as yet unused. In fact, at that time the ICC was renting out its courtrooms to the Special Court of Sierra Leone because they needed courtrooms and the ICC wasn't using them. The second anecdote is when a few years later I was back in The Hague as a postdoc working for the Grotius Centre, that's part of Leiden University, where one of the regular activities there was to train professionals in international criminal law. And on this occasion, a group of seasoned judges from Uganda who had been sitting on the bench for many, many years. They came to The Hague to be trained, and they themselves were specialists in criminal law, and they came to be trained in international criminal law by what seemed to me this sort of young bunch of international criminal law entrepreneurs. And again, I wasn't involved in the training. My task was to look after the photo opportunity. So there was a great fuss made about the photo op and the certificates which would be handed out to these Ugandan judges. And I was given the task to run down to the local copy shop and get these certificates printed out, and then to write a headline on the centre's website: Ugandan judges successfully trained in international criminal law. And again, it really struck me that I was somehow part of a marketing exercise of selling something. And I don't think with this audience it needs to be spelled out, but I'm sure you can imagine the blindness exercise there to histories of imperialism, right? There were these white, mostly male, mid-30s professionals in what used to be the center of the Dutch Empire, training a group of judges from the global south and then handing over these certificates for a photo opportunity. So these are just two very brief anecdotes which created some questions for me about this selling of global justice. And so I thought I'd just read out the first paragraph of the introduction of the book, which begins with a quote from the documentary film Prosecutor. The prosecutor has to be a bit of a salesman. He has to persuade people to accept a new idea, global justice, selling global justice. Why is it unremarkable for the prosecutor of the world's first permanent international criminal court to be described as a salesman? Why does it appear normal for the last surviving prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials, Benjamin Ferencz, to use marketing terminology to state, "My slogan has always been law, not war"? Equally unremarkable is the claim of the second chief prosecutor of the ICC that the return on our investment for what others may today consider to be a huge cost for justice is effective deterrence and saving millions of victims' lives. And it seems entirely ordinary, if rather comical, that a poster for a documentary on the ICC should depict a judge, the chief prosecutor, the deputy prosecutor standing resolutely against a black background, half turned sideways to the viewer, a scene reminiscent of a movie poster of a John Grisham meets Goodfellas adaptation. In one version of that poster, by the way, Angelina Jolie was also in that. This book is a critical study of the marketing practices adopted to sell global justice and the attendant primacy of market values over social values. So that's the introduction, but the book is, I hope, not itself without hope, as in something that I try to work through, particularly in the final chapter, where I consider a form of what I call occupied global justice, which is inspired by the Occupy movement, but also aims to deal with some of the limitations of the Occupy movement itself, and does that particularly through taking decolonization seriously. So it's by no means a book that proposes a blueprint for unmarketized global justice or anti-marketized global justice, but it includes some tactics which might be used in the struggle against marketized global justice. And so I thought, finally, after reading the first paragraph of the book, I'd read out from the conclusion the final, actually from the final chapter. And I found two horrendous typos actually while preparing. So, but I'll read the paragraph anyway. It's on occupied global justice. Occupied global justice is about radical departures. In the decolonization literature and praxis, this sentiment comes to the fore in a pedagogy of pursuing the irreconcilable and the incommensurable. Decolonization has recently become a buzzword, overlaid onto other struggles or simply replacing critique. When Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang insisted that decolonization is not a metaphor, they were articulating the danger of decolonization as slogan or as brand. In this marketized form, decolonization no longer generates discomfort for the existing structural inequalities. Decolonization as struggle, however, remains uncomfortable and unsettling. In order for it to maintain its distance and otherness to marketized global justice projects, any moves to innocence of the dominating powers must be foreclosed. Ultimately, decolonization is incommensurable with reconciling a colonial past with the present. In this way, decolonization as a tactic moves us closer to anti-imperialism as strategy. So thank you so much again, and I'm really looking forward to the impressions of Melissa, or of Eric, Melissa, and Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for this introduction to your work. Eric, do you want to open up with your reflections on the book?
Oh, definitely. I certainly do. And it's going to be hard keeping them to 10 minutes because there's just, well, so much here. And one of the things I just found so remarkable about this book is just how I think it expresses what many of us have felt at this level of cynicism about this whole project of international justice at one point or another. And how can I feel good about any of this when there's this commodification of it, and puts many of us down this critical path. And I think that makes the book all the more impressive, because sometimes the hardest things to write is that very systematic study of what so many of us feel at this intuitive level. So in my just general take on the book, and the angle I found interesting just looking at through my own research lens, is what are the larger historical conditions of possibility for this hyper neoliberal model of international criminal justice? And in this, I'm thinking about, well, could this be framed through this lens of hegemony, understood in the way presented, I think, very well by Rob Knox, where you have to consider both hegemony as the geopolitics, but also the ideology operating together, and these things are often considered separate. But the more materialist take on international law really is this great opportunity to unite them. And here, I think the chapter that really sets up this historic conditions of possibility in Christine's book is in chapter 3, where she really highlights how the 1990s were this incredible watershed moment here. So this is the time where there is that whole turn to corporate branding, where things are sold to be part of a lifestyle as opposed to the utility of whatever product you're buying. So it's this whole new level of the triumph of exchange value over use value. At the same time, it's this transformation of international law. So more forms of intervention, weakening of sovereignty. Can we intervene to prevent atrocity or promote democracy, et cetera? Also, big time of structuring of the global economy through law in ways beyond anything that existed before. So the moment the WTO comes together as it did. And then also, and what's very important to the whole international criminal law aspect, this whole idea of individual responsibility. So it's not just about these sovereign collectives, but individuals. And underlying all of this is this time of unquestioned American dominance. So I think this is a really great depiction of the unique moment of the 90s in bringing this about. But I think one thing that international lawyers, even though we tend to be very focused on the 90s as this moment, especially for many of us who didn't really experience it or were kids at the time like I was, where it's like, oh, wow, people actually believed this stuff back then? Whoa. I think one thing we have to consider in light of that is that immediate before time. So the 1980s. And I think that's a time frame that we haven't really fully theorized in international legal thought. And I think how that's relevant to so many of the themes Christine brings up in the book is that at this time, these understandings of human rights, international law, humanitarianism, accountability were much, much less hegemonic. And just kind of thinking about like certain examples from even just saying the discourse surrounding resistance to Reagan doctrine interventions in Central America. And again, in a very American context, of course, different elsewhere in the world. But there you had like all these different diverse groupings being invested in this project for different reasons. So you had things like the church and organized religion. You had what was left of, the left, because this was one of the few times where labor unions actually broke from this Cold War politics to actually take this anti-imperialist stance on these issues, and just so many different things. But then the triumph that came in the 90s, despite this diversity, was what Andrew Fagan refers to as this gentrified human rights, this idea of this is the morality of this emerging like transnational professional class empowered by this neoliberal globalization. And on that basis, things like international criminal justice really are the model for that. So it could be seen as the state of things where this is the morality of a particular worldview where the world is America and must be rebuilt in the image of America, but America is its middle class. So there's no more real mainstream, or at least even visibly counter-hegemonic usage of human rights discourse for improving the status of the working class, shifting that balance of power. But no, we're all in this universal aspirational world where we can all achieve these middle-class values and this middle-class lifestyle, and American power is going to be what gets us there. And we just have to have this, but we need to have this moral underpinning of that. And that's something that this highly marketized version of international criminal justice really was mobilized to provide. So that, and I could go on and on about this, but I'm conscious of time and do want to hear from our other panelists. But I guess to sort of conclude here, I think right now we're in an interesting place where so much of that 90s dream, very much a distant memory, and in a lot of ways, a lot of the 80s stuff and a lot of these 80s themes seems much more, just much more relevant. So time of American hegemony in question. Of course, Trump is this supreme embodiment of this corporate brand lifestyle ideology. And then also connected to Trump, this whole phenomenon of QAnon conspiracies that in a strange way kind of almost seem this para form of international criminal justice. They depict their enemies as inhuman monsters, sickos, lizards, etc. There's this fixation on legal vindication and carceral punishment, lock her up, as in reference to Hillary Clinton. Very much believed, despite non-basis in much material reality. and also is a product of an elaborate marketing lifestyle branding program that really capitalizes on a lot of the cynicism about things like global justice, social justice, et cetera, that were very much promoted by the same branding of international criminal justice that Christine just describes so well in this book. So that's my general take. I'm still kind of organizing my thoughts on the matter, but just want to thank everyone for making this event possible, and very special thanks to Christine.
Thanks so much, Eric, for setting the book out into sort of broader questions about the historiography of international law, etc., which is, yeah, quite an important theme. Perhaps we can return to in the discussion. Hunter, do you want?
Yes, my turn.
Yes, please. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for organizing this, and thanks to you and Christine both for the very nice introduction. Yeah, this is a fabulous book, Christine. Thank you for writing it. It was a real treat to have the opportunity to take a look at it in depth, and to feel justified in doing so. I actually, you know, not just trying to make reading into a hobby, but this was actually something really that I wanted to engage with. So thank you. It was so generative, probably too generative for 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. It was really provocative for me. I had lots of questions come to mind on a whole bunch of different issues, not specifically questions for you, but just, I don't know, questions for the world. And really we'll try to kind of identify some of those and put them out there. It's just a really essential contribution to critical studies of international law, first of all, like a classic text that I think will go on the bookshelf with so many others. It's really rich and multifaceted. Really enjoyed how it brought in the communication studies element. I think really broadened the conversation about the complicity of international law in the exploitation of the global South in various forms. So that was really nice to see, and it can be situated too as a continuation of the trend in critical research on international law of moving toward the historical, although a very shorter historical trajectory, but still did a really nice job, I thought, of tracing how things came to be and how these different shifts happened. And I enjoyed the focus on struggle within that, the kind of Gramscian contestation over different dominant notions of different concepts like global justice. The shifts, yeah, Eric was talking about chapter 3, and I actually want to assign that to my students in one of my courses. It's really fabulous. It really goes through the 90s, this awful decade, and different shifts there. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in the intersections between human rights and international criminal law and the anti-impunity movement to check that out, because I think Christine does a really beautiful job of weaving those together and showing the different intersections there. I thought there were some really interesting parallels as well to a number of recent books. Jess White's book on human rights, Grisha Bars's book on the corporation law and capitalism, and many other really great texts. In particular, I thought it was interesting how you were talking about the 90s as a decade when there was this shift in understandings of global justice and approaches to implementing those understandings from responsibility, state responsibility, to putting responsibility on individuals, which seemed to be the inverse of what Grisha was talking about in her book, looking at corporate accountability, which was tracing a shift from the CEO, the people, individuals, being responsible for what the corporation does, to the corporate entity. So really interesting there how international law can simultaneously do both of those things. And I thought it was really great how you traced all of that to this narrowing of the ideas of what is possible, and looked at who benefits. And this is really, I think, something momentous and a really big feat that is really exciting to see, right? Like I think we think about the big picture processes, and then sometimes we look at the specific examples, but being able to connect those so well, I think is really something. And so yeah, commend you for that. I'll try to put my questions into just a couple of groups, and again, they're kind of more musings for the world at large. The first one had to do with capitalism. And in the book, you show so nicely how neoliberalism is really intertwined with these processes, that marketized global justice is both symptomatic of and also advances neoliberalism. And so I wanted to kind of ask you this annoying question that I often get, to kind of flip it back and say, okay, there is a tremendous amount of this that is specific to neoliberalism, but how much of this is about capitalism more generally? And it's not to say that it's not neoliberalism and that the focus isn't justified, because it really is, and we can see this in the focus on competition, for instance, on changes to subjectivity, for instance, around victims, how victims see themselves and are portrayed, the emphasis not just on making a profit, but also on the depoliticization, dehistoricization, all of those things, making the market safe from democracy. But I'm wondering how much of the story is about capitalism itself as well. So, I mean, how is this also a story of capitalism co-opting yet another thing that had some potential to do good? Is this in part a story about the example of redistribution, for example? So precluding redistribution and discussions of redistribution, was redistribution, or to what extent was redistribution ever really possible? And was it marketization that precluded that? Was it already fairly tenuous? And then the discussion of spectacle, which I also really loved. It was just done really well. And spectacle, not just as an aesthetic thing, but as an ordering function, which was really nicely done. And but then I was wondering, and this was the images, for those who haven't read the book, the different images of victimhood, the ideal victim being portrayed and used in publicity in order to garner Western donations. It was a great example of how these processes actually unfold. But as I was reading it, I was also thinking about Doug Hay's work on the kind of majesty of law in capitalism, and all of the kind of aesthetics around the robes and the kind of pomp and circumstance around capitalist law. And so wondering again, the spectacle being neoliberal or capitalist, or both. Neoliberalism, obviously part of capitalism. And I was wondering a little bit about juridification too. It seems, and this is, I thought, really interesting, that this story of marketizing global justice, in a sense, was also a continuation maybe of a juridification of global justice. So taking something that wasn't necessarily juridical and framing it in terms of first, human rights and international criminal law and this whole trajectory. And so I was wondering to what extent maybe that resonated with you as well. The second question I had, or set of questions, had to do with what was, and it's related, what was driving this process? And I almost want someone else, and I really hope that people do take up this work using the framework that Christine has laid out, because I think it's really, really excellent. I want someone to now do a study of those NGOs specifically, because I want to know, what people were thinking, what was actually driving this. So Christine does a really nice job of saying, these are conscious and unconscious moves by different actors, and different chapters go through different examples. But I'm wondering too, what were those discussions like? Was this a different approach that was just kind of adopted with just uncritically, without any dissent or debate amongst the different actors? Did they all go to the same conference on how to get more donations? And to what extent are people conscious, those actors conscious of what they're doing? Are they trying to engage in marketing and contribute to this process of commodification of victimhood and capitalization and capital accumulation? So there's a bit, that I was just wondering there, and really, I mean, it's some of it goes beyond the purview of this book even, but I'm interested in who actually supports this version of global justice and who is kind of going along with it because it happened to align with their own interests. And how did it come to align with their own interests? Was there like a crisis of those NGOs not getting enough donation funding? Was there something that created this need for some new approach, or just, I don't know, ideology, people, all the different influences that change our approaches to these things? Anyway, so that's the second set of questions. And then the third one has to do with this idea of what is specifically global about marketized global justice. And I'm thinking there just about, and this isn't a question necessarily, Christine, you have to answer, I'm thinking about the different domestic parallels in slightly different areas. And I hope that again, people pick this up and maybe look at this in future research. One of these is other political campaigns. So Christine has reproduced the image of Obama, those Obama posters, which are quite iconic. And it seems, she talks about the branding of politicians. And I think branding and that kind of marketing has become a feature of those political campaigns as well. Also connections to the publicity state. So this idea of Kozlenka's that their state itself, our governments are engaging in a lot more PR, trying to sell their governance to the people who will elect them or whom they hope will elect them again. So just some interesting parallels and or potential parallels. I think there are also some differences in terms of how the ideal victim is constructed in terms of just domestic criminal law. So yeah, so that was a whole area that really jumped out at me. And then finally, I just want to commend Christine for really jumping into some of these questions about resistance, because I think they're really difficult, they're really thorny, and everyone has different takes on these. And I thought that Christine did a really nice job of going through a number of different approaches to resistance to these different patterns, and being really, I think, open about being critical of even ones that I think we might intuitively think are the good ones or the better ones. And so I think that was done really well. I totally want to get into the nitty-gritty of that because it is something, as Eva mentioned, that I research and enjoy researching all the time. But I will leave it there. I just want to say in conclusion that this is just a really fabulous book, and I think that it will generate a lot of conversations to come. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks a lot. So last but not least, we'll close with the thoughts by Melissa.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm Melissa Aronchik at Rutgers University, and I am the non-lawyer in the room, the non-legal scholar. And so when I first received an email from Christine about her book, and I saw the title of this book, Marketing Global Justice, the Political Economy of International Criminal Law, I thought, really, my first thought was, why is she sending this to me? I thought, I know very little about international criminal law, and I know even less about the political economy of international criminal law. And then I had a second concern when I saw the word marketing in the title. I thought, is this going to be yet another book that uncritically applies the language of branding to phenomena that have nothing to do with branding? I'm sorry to say I have seen far too many books and articles that use the term branding as a convenient, simplistic, and just trendy gloss to account for a range of complex historical phenomena whether it is World War II commentary or 19th century South American festivals or the making of the US Constitution. You know, I've seen all of these things and they're often quite anachronistic. So you can imagine, those of you who have had the fortune to encounter this book, my relief and delight when I began to read Christine's book, because it is compellingly written and well researched, but more importantly, a very deftly analyzed work of scholarship that has really helped me think through some intellectual problems that I've been wrestling with when it comes to thinking about the phenomenon of branding and how it has indeed filtered into so many domains of society. So, I mean, perhaps the lesson for me is don't judge a book by its cover. It's one lesson we always need to take, but beyond that, in my remarks, I want to talk about how I have been thinking with Christine, so to speak, through my reading of this book, Marketing Global Justice. And I want to especially talk about how I think this book is valuable to scholars in media studies, communication, and critical cultural studies. So let me start with the early part of Christine's book. And so for those of you who haven't read it, I'll try to just contextualize briefly. So somewhere in the, around page 25 or 26, Christine writes about quite a spectacular case, quite literally a spectacular case of a war criminal drinking poison during a filmed courtroom procedure. So he elects to drink poison and to commit suicide rather than to be tried or taken into account by the Court of International Criminal Procedure. And it would be easy to call this a made-for-media event or a classic case of the so-called society of the spectacle, which Jacques Derrida coined so many years ago. And it would have been even easier to characterize this as the new brand of criminal portrayals, like a kind of media-friendly, film or TV-friendly version of criminal representation. And Christine immediately dispels with all that. And instead, she points out that the very fact is that it's not just about the fact that it is fashionable to employ marketing terminology to casually deem accusations of committing war crimes bad publicity. Instead, we need to look at how the use of marketing practices and terminology tells us something important about the way in which global justice is understood. So that's a quote from Christine's book. And so the inflection point is on global justice. And it is here that we begin to understand the themes that Christine is raising and their implications. It is not just about how global justice is represented in media contexts, nor is it just about how the idea of judicial process has been sold to various stakeholders. It is about, instead, how the real world experience of global justice has itself been depleted and with what implications for how society apprehends mass crimes in a political economy that privileges the application of these very problematic social constructions to appeal to international publics. So what we are seeing and what we see as Christine takes us through other cases in this book is a series of international criminal cases that are designed to reduce complexity and gain legitimacy in certain spheres. And this indeed is at the heart of the branding incentive, which is to make a problem appear more palatable, more tangible, and indeed more rational than it actually is. Making global justice into a problem, say, of good and evil, which is a theme Christine works us through in the book, that it's sort of reduced to good and evil, or making it into something where criminals are individually responsible for their guilt, which is another important theme. This is a process of making international criminal law appealing to a broader range of publics. And you are just emphasizing certain values and beliefs, but when you do that, you are reducing the possibility for other values and beliefs to be tested. So I read in Christine's work how it has become more important, for instance, to seek guilty parties than to admit social or institutional failings, or indeed, as Eric brought up, historical and cultural realities, and how it's more important in this branded version of global justice to frame victims as weak and frail than to understand the dynamic social and mutually interfacing effects of perpetrators and victims. So in the process of appealing to as broad an audience as possible, which is a branding injunction, we are distorting the purpose of international criminal law. As Christine then points out, this is not just about narratives. It is not just about, say, performative speech acts around the purpose of international criminal law, or how it is represented in mediated ways. It is also especially about the political economic structures that construct and uphold it. And I think this is what Honor was speaking about in her presentation. And so for me, the parallels with important works that deal with, for instance, how NGOs are part of this story are Clifford Bobb's 2005 book, The Marketing of Rebellion, which is about the marketing of international activism and the network of NGOs that contribute to that. And more recently, Monica Krause's wonderful 2014 book, The Good Project, which is about humanitarian relief NGOs and a very similar kind of process to what Christine is getting at in her book in a different industry, a different context. Both those books, both Clifford Bobb's book and Monica Krause's book, are about the transformation of international organizations in the context of pressures from the market, the supply chain, and this network of institutions and practices that together constitute the phenomenon called international aid. So in Christine's treatment in Marketing Global Justice, we see how international criminal law is not just about the norms or the narratives or the standards of practice, but about the very structure of global civil society, which is made up of the NGOs, the UN agencies, the intergovernmental organizations, and how they interlock and collaboratively create these categories of meaning and value within which international criminal law then has to function. So it's a much broader story that Christine is telling us than just about global justice per se. In order for global civil society to accept international criminal law as valid and legitimate, it seems it has to create stereotypes of victims and perpetrators, moral positions of good and evil, and very particular representations of crime, so that the society we live in then can benefit from the application of international criminal law. But as we see, it's kind of a putting the cart before the horse, or some sort of cycle rather that's taking place where we have these structures in society and then international criminal law, which might have been designed to push back against these structures, rather corresponds to them and then helps to further constitute them. So we are sort of caught in this vicious cycle. One of the most important observations I think Christine makes, and that in the Q&A, Christine, I would love to hear more about or discuss this, is how many Western myths are enrolled into this version of international criminal law, as you point out in your book. Westerners, it appears, want to see criminals and courts and prosecutors and social movements that are recognizable to them as such. They want to see geographies organized according to Western assumptions about which regions, which peoples, which classes are developed and which are underdeveloped, which are, how is the global North set up and how is the global South set up? So again, why is it that in the West, we seem to want these categories reinforced so dramatically? And then how can we think about the ways that ICL has just responded to this? It seems that one possible reason could be that the Western donor audience is the ultimate audience that is being appealed to. And so you have ICL bending to cater to the needs of this audience. And if that were true, that would be very much in line with the branding framework. I'll just close with one last thought, and this is something I've been trying to write about quite a bit back in when I first wrote Branding the Nation, and with a new book I'm working that has just come out. I say I'm working on it. It's never finished, but it just came out. How do we think about the promotional industries more broadly and how they have fit into this argument or this conversation we're having? So by promotional industries, I want to refer to the branding industry, but also marketing more broadly, lobbying, public relations, advertising. So I consider all of those what I call the promotional industries. And I think perhaps one key to understanding them and their influence is to recognize that they are not value neutral channels of communication, but rather value laden propositions. If we take these industries together, branding, marketing, and so on, public relations, if we look at nearly all of the writing about these industries from an organizational perspective, so a sort of uncritical administrative perspective, we would learn that these industries are mainly about building public awareness, about persuading undecided consumers or voters, and about influencing behavioral change. What this writing almost never considers is the extent to which these industries are themselves creative actors in the process of knowledge production. Instead, we tend, and even when we are being critical, even when we try to take up this organizational literature and push back on it, I think we cause part of the problem by accepting those propositions as they are. We see these industries like PR as mediating existing knowledge, as value neutral intermediaries. And I am convinced the more time I spend researching these industries, that they are instead value-driven social agents. They are ideologically motivated to create the world according to a particular image, one that is structured by international governance through markets, capitalism, hierarchies of capital and class, and Western hegemony. And so I propose that we start to see these actors in these fields as an epistemic community in its own right. That is, as a promotional class that is engaged in the production of knowledge that itself creates and structures our political and cultural categories in order to foster consensus and approval around particular values, and that then we look at how these lead to institutional and policy decisions. The most important thing I think I have retained, I wouldn't tell everyone else what to retain, what I have mostly retained from Christine's account that has helped me the most is that it need not be this way. The pursuit of global justice need not look the way it does in the treatment that Christine brings us in her book. There are alternative processes that we can bring and adopt to bring to account those who are responsible for the reprehensible and cruel mass crimes that ICL is designed to respond to. But in order for it to become otherwise, we have to be able to imagine the alternatives. And I think this starts with dismantling what is, showing the contradictions, the anachronisms, or the failings. And so it is for this reason that I find Christine's book so generative and so useful, is that it helps us to do exactly that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That was terrific. And Christine, do you want to reply first a little bit to some initial thoughts about what you've heard? We have already some questions in the chat. I had one myself, but I think they've raised a lot of kind of important points for you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I can't do these questions and provocations justice. But I thought I would start with one of them, which maybe sort of is an overarching theme, which when I was writing the book, and particularly when I was finishing it, I sort of, and I think this is the sentiment that Melissa just said, you never really finish the books, you just sort of move on then, but you're still working through it. And I had a sense of perhaps I've grasped what was happening in the 1990s, but maybe this is already, I'm writing about something as though it were current, although it's already over. And I think that the specific aspect where I had that feeling was about competition. And that sort of comes to some of the questions that Eric and Honor in particular were highlighting about neoliberalism and capitalism, perhaps. I was one and have been working more now on competition, wondering whether the competition that I set out there in the global justice sector, which then, you know, through marketing, certain voices are highlighted and others are silenced, and through then the distribution that happens through that process, that leads to this silencing. How that was working from the 1990s to perhaps the 2010s, I think is perhaps different now. I think that is, as you can tell, I'm still sort of working through that. But I think what is occurring is that competition is working in a different way, and we need to understand competition in a different way, and that there are different actors, and that international organizations have sort of become part of a different understanding. So what I've moved on to focusing much more on recently is rentier capitalism. In thinking about the going from competition to really oligarchs, right? And I think that this is where Eric's talking about, you know, what periods in time can we compare that more to the 1980s, what's happening now, I think is really fascinating. That's one of the that's something that was sort of happening perhaps in your questions, provocations, a bit around the edges there. That's something I've been working trying to work through. Perhaps this comes to the question that keeps on being posed about, is this the end of neoliberalism? What is the end of neoliberalism? Oh no, you must be, you know, this is a recurring question. There are so many articles and books written on, I don't know, in its various different forms, zombie, neoliberal, what have you. But I would say that what I was interested in terms of neoliberalism, distinguishing it as a particular period within capitalism, is this aspect of the neoliberal order. And that's where I think that really following your work too, that's where law plays a crucial stabilizing role in having created this particular order. Now, that can also be destabilized again, which is where I think it is worth thinking then periodically about what is happening. Is that order being destabilized at present through a new order that is focused more on undoing some of those structures and replacing them with you know, the types of Elon Musk types and so on, where the question of the receding of the state again is introduced. In my book, the state and the market are prominent as working together, and I think that's a snapshot, a particular historical snapshot of neoliberalism. And then I just wanted to say something about Honor's questions on NGOs, and that's come up in other conversations on the book as well. And I think there is almost a parallel book that could have been written on the empirical questions there, right? So, and it's certainly something that I considered. I'm no good at any of that. I would have been rubbish at writing that book, but someone else can take that up and run with it, and that would be amazing. Absolutely. Thinking about, NGOs, when are the decisions made? What I can say from speaking to many people who work in The Hague in those international organizations and non-governmental organizations is that a lot of them, all of them really, are aware of that branded version of global justice that they're employing, and they view it cynically and critically, and nevertheless they run with it because it is that dominant form of talking about justice. And so I think it's so interesting, again, as potentially an empirical question of where can that be ruptured? If there is knowledge of almost the ridiculousness of it as well, how can that then be transformed? So I think that's a really fascinating question. And then Melissa, I was making so many notes while you were talking. I wish I'd used your term of promotional industries in the book. It would have made my chapter 1 or whatever it was. It would have made it so much easier to bring it under that neat headline. But I think what you're saying about the epistemic community is so resonant with my troubling and feeling troubled about marketing and branding, is the depoliticized way in which we view we view what you called the knowledge production that comes from this promotional class. And I thought it was really fascinating again that you focused there on highlighting the question of value, because again that is something that I feel is central here to understanding. I mean, I sort of quite crudely, I think, in the book, use value and exchange value and market value and social value as shortcuts to thinking about these things. But I think actually I'm saying that it's crudely myself, because I think that there's so much more there, and something that I'm still working through to think about. What you say. Value-driven social agents. What is this value? How is it being created, and so on? So lots to think about there. And thank you so much for your engagement and your generous reading also of the book.
Thank you, Christine. I should say also that we plan to have an online hosting of the written version of the contributions on the blog Legal Forms. So I'm sure that you will all have the opportunity also to read more in-depth engagements after the event. I had one question, but because we have already 2 from the audience, I think I would want to start with them, if that's okay, Christine. And first we have a question by Rui. Do you want to raise it yourself, or should I just read what you have written in the chat?
You can do it.
Okay, great.
I think it's easy.
So he says, magnificent event. I couldn't agree with you more. Can global marketization of justice promote solidarity? How do you define solidarity in relation to global justice? So that's one question for you. A first question for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly plays a role in the final chapter, where I think the danger in, so I often get accused by my students of being cynical, right? But I think the danger in that is then to see all productive and historically also productive terms and movements as all open to to being marketised and dominated and emptied of meaning, and the solidarity is one of these terms that I think has such strong historical connections to workers' movements in the global South, that it is one of those terms that I think needs to be retained for its political productivity. And I think that global justice is also one of those terms. The global justice movement in the 1990s really was focused on undoing some of those structures that it already saw as being put in place through globalization processes and through its institutions. So yes, solidarity, I think, is one of those terms that it remains productive and remains something that can be used counter or against marketization. But I'm curious to hear really what you think about solidarity, and whether that resonates with your view, or whether you know, I'm looking right here. I've got actually here a face mask which has got solidarity written all over it in different languages, and which is potentially, you know, is that already a marketized form of solidarity? So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. There's a question also from Neve Gordon in the chat. Neve, do you want to just, I mean, I can read again, but it's nice to hear from the audience if any of you feel comfortable.
Hi, so thanks so much. This is amazing. I mean, I haven't read the book, and it really sounds fascinating. And if I understand correctly from discussion, a lot of things are being marketized here, and institutions and and a conception of justice. And then the question is, if there's a kind of a need to marketize an international criminal law, it seems to me that the conception of justice that it offers ultimately is it's against impunity, it's bringing the person to justice, but ultimately it's a kind of carceral justice. We need to put this person away, right? And so is that being marketized aggressively in order not to deal with the real, or with the structural issues of injustice, the kind of socioeconomic? Is that one of the reasons that there's a need? So we don't need to talk about redistribution or reparation. Is that what's going on here?
Yes, exactly. So that's kind of what the book tries to do, to show how this, what you call carceral justice, has how it became dominant in order to silence redistributive versions of global justice. And what I try to do in the book is just to say that this was not inevitable, right? This was part of very particular political, historical moments. And I think that the point on the carcerality is so fascinating, right? Because this is it's really underemphasized in international criminal law, and where, you know, there's very little actually in the discipline. There's very little research done on. There is research done, but very little emphasis done on once these individuals have been sentenced, where do they go? How, you know, there's a lot of questions about the length of the sentences in weighed against or balanced against the gravity of the crime and so on. But the actual carcerality question locking up of someone is really underemphasized. That seems the inevitable consequence of the evil. It's that someone is locked up, and the fascinating discussions from criminology, for example, and critical criminology that have come up, and also from social movements about abolition and so on. They have not penetrated international criminal law at all, and I think that the reason why is because the focus is on the judgment of good and evil. Yeah.
Great. We have 2 or 3 more questions. Kanad, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry, I have to switch off my camera for the moment. But no, really, thank you very much for the event, and also Christine and the other commentators. I have a very short question. I'm sorry that I have not yet been able to get my hands on the book, so please do excuse me if this comes across as rather pedestrian. I'm wondering what makes marketing global justice sort of different from marketing and branding that happens with, let's say, the rule of law or human rights. Does international law have to play? Does it play a very different or a very specific role in the global justice project, as opposed to the project and the marketing of human rights, rule of law, and the other different ways of civilizing as we know? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kanad, and thanks for that question. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're all sort of a part of that process of individualizing. But what's specific about international criminal law, I would say, are the institutions that have attracted the resources in order to in order to build this huge industry, right? So the multiple tribunals and the International Criminal Court and so on. So I think that's what's specific about that part of what I call the global justice sector. And I hope that sort of resonates with perhaps how you see how the rule of law and human rights and international criminal justice might interact. And what I argue in the book is that it is the simplistic messaging. This human rights, I think, is a more complicated and complex message. It's about holding the state to account, state actors to account. International criminal law has really capitalized on the simple message of identifying that one wrongdoer, the one evil person, and then playing on those tropes of racializing and gendering and so on that come with that. So that's what I think distinguishes international criminal law from other contenders there.
Great. We have also a question from Leila.
Thank you so much to Christine and all the speakers. That was really terrific. It's a wonderful book. I'm not quite finished, but it's really amazing. Thanks so much for writing it, Christine. I had a question around, because we were talking about how things are moving so fast and are changing. And I was wondering how you see marketing strategies of the international justice, but also the international development sector changing in the most recent iteration. Also building on Melissa's point about international organizations being knowledge producers in their own right. And I have that question because I worked for UN organizations relatively recently in 2017, and I worked on coordination, which is basically another word for competition, right? It's essentially competition of these different organizations and NGOs for funding. And my sense was that their obsession was really about innovation and data. The way they felt they could edge out competitors was by getting big new surveys, shiny new data, and that could help them to tell better impact stories, and that would persuade donors. So they were still using, of course, images of victimhood and suffering, and all these images were still around, but there seemed to be a limit in which you can have better images of victimhood than your competitor, but you can have actually better data than your competitor, or something that is more innovative, right? So I was wondering how you see that potentially play out. Maybe it was just anecdotal in my sort of personal experience with those organizations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Leila. And in a way, you know, you're doing this really important empirical work as well, and from your own experience of the field. So, and I think that that's really fascinating how you're describing that the obsession with data, and in a way, the conclusion we've all come to already is that the marketized version of global justice somehow failed, right? It was naff and it was icky, and this shedding then of the ickiness of marketized global justice, where that goes is really fascinating. And to hear from you that one of the directions it's taken is to go to data, which is the new thing, is really fascinating to hear, and also unsurprising, and probably unsurprising to you too. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Great. We have a question also from Abdullah. Abdullah, do you want to say it, or I can just read it? It's very brief. Is there a fine line between marketing and propaganda?
Yes, great question. It's one I love discussing with my students as well, and I assume that from posing this question you already think that there is or perhaps there's no distinction between marketing and propaganda. I do discuss it a little bit in the book, simply because I was fascinated that I had always, perhaps through the own propaganda that I'd been subjected to, thought that propaganda was something that came only from, fascist states where there's one state machinery of communication. And in fact, when digging into the history of propaganda, and Melissa will know a lot more about this than I do. In fact, it's very much connected to the liberal states, histories of the liberal state and warmongering, particularly of the UK and the US. So yes, I think what is fascinating is that Fatou Bensouda, the former prosecutor, she has called she is called sort of communications against the ICC. She's called those propaganda, and so the way in which propaganda is utilized in these discussions, and who accuses whom of propaganda, is really fascinating. But certainly they're absolutely interconnected.
Great. Christine, there's at least 2 or 3 more questions. Would you prefer to have them all in one go, or shall we just continue one by one to give you the time? It's 25 past. I mean, we can overrun a little bit, 5-10 minutes, because we began 5 minutes late, if the other discussants are happy with that. You prefer to go one by one, Christine? Yeah, okay, great. Isabel, do you want to raise your question, or shall I just read it?
You can read it, Ava. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for a terrific event. I'm itching to read the book. I would love to hear more about the people and entities involved in marketing activities. I'm wondering if these roles are in-house or outsourced to promotional industry actors. Also wondering whether in-house promotional activities in international organizations have changed in the last years. Thinking about the change in the UN when the Department for Public Information became the Department of Global Communications, for example.
A brilliant question, Isabel. I did at some point get into this rabbit hole of trying to do research on this. It's a mixture of both, is the very short answer. And it's quite difficult to get information on the in-house ones, of course, public relations departments and so on. That all international organizations have them, but the outsourced ones, it's quite difficult to get information on these, although they do exist. They tend to be more sort of project-based, but yeah, it's a fascinating area of research, and to I'm just trying to think of a productive way of talking about it. I'm sort of thinking again about nation branding and which nations and cities and places brand themselves as part of this global justice sector. So I've already mentioned The Hague, and then in the book I also discuss South Africa and then Cambodia. And in that industry specifically, it really goes back to a very few, and Melissa knows a lot more about this, it goes back to very few individuals who have been driving nation branding, place branding, city branding. And it's really interesting how all this whole discipline and this whole industry goes back to these individuals. You know, it's if you're interested in sort of conspiracy theories and industries, then this is really, this is really productive, because there you can see those individual actors. For international organizations, I wish that research had been done, and it would be great to see that kind of research being done, but it hasn't been done. I wasn't able to do it in the book.
Great. Shahrzad, you want to come in as well with your question?
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, thanks very much, Christine, for amazing talk. Sorry, I haven't read your book, but definitely I'm planning to get hold of a copy of yours. So I'm wondering, I'm coming from international criminal law background, but also I'm wondering about a discussion in relation to others, the other, and us. It seems to be, it's the agenda. It's about, we are fine, we are fighting, or we are creating something which is all about the other, perhaps coming from the chronology of Garland's point of view. But also in regard to international organizations, I'm wondering, perhaps as one of the actors, I'm not sure, I haven't read your book, so forgive me about that, but I wonder if that international organizations, for example, any of the UN bodies connected to that, what was the agenda behind pushing for creating such establishments? Was it something to do with kind of self-promoting agenda that they are following, or they were following? I'm not sure, but perhaps something in line with the last question, Isabel. So it was a self-promoting of the UN bodies going for these, and we can see similar perhaps patterns in relation to suppressive conventions as well, which goes to more of the transnational criminal law, not so much of the international criminal law. But yeah, I wonder what are your thoughts about that, actually? Thanks very much.
Thanks for that question. So the process of othering, as you quite rightly call it, is endemic in how international organizations have been working, and but at the same time, or many of them, right, at the same time, the the tension there. So coming from an international criminal law background, I'm sure you're familiar with the argument of I don't know what the problem is with othering, because after all, the International Criminal Court has 120 whatever member states, and that includes lots of states from the global south. So how can this be a discipline that others, and that is Western, right? So this is sort of a very common way of trying to deal with what we are clearly seeing as a difference which is produced and reproduced between the global north and the global south, and so one of the elements that I focus on in the book is this question of spectacularizing and spectacle, and how the focus on victimhood is a vehicle through which then that othering is produced and reproduced, and I call it the production of in the global north. There is this knowing, seeing. There are there's the knowing and the seeing, and in the global south there's the seen, and so who is seeing which who are the actors that are seeing and who are the actors who are seen, I think is really crucial in terms of thinking about how global justice is framed as something that is dispensed, as my colleague Tor Craver quite rightly calls it. So right, the dispensing of global justice coming from the global north. So yes, in the book I try to work with this othering through the question of spectacle and the question of the visual. And of course I was fascinated by that because that is such a crucial part of marketing and branding, right? We've spoken about simplification of the language that happens there, and then but the visual aspect is so important. And it sounds trite to say we live in a visual world, but that is certainly the case, and that is certainly the case when we imagine global justice and dealing with global injustices.
Great, thank you so much. So I think, I had a question, but maybe it's getting a bit late, and maybe I can ask you after, or I don't know. It feels I don't want to sort of keep the proceedings going for too long on a Friday evening, and I would rather spend some time just saying really thank you to. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. It has been recorded, so you'll be able to sort of watch it again online, but I think this kind of interdisciplinary engagement worked very well also for you, Christine, and really bringing out how complex, how many different strands there are really in your book of ideas, of arguments, of concepts. So I really just wanted to thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Christine, Eric, Honor, and Melissa, and the audience, of course.
Thank you, everyone.